loud.
Hello, and welcome to Making Waves to Move to Joy, a series of mini webinars where Johanna and Marie get real about the ebb and flow of finding lasting joy and happiness as women and as leaders. And so we're here to help you get the most value from this session. If you joined because you want to understand why you lost your joy, see a clear path to regaining your spark, and learn how to sustain it in your work, you're in the right place. Over this 6-part webinar here in season 2, we'll help you gain some insights into what's blocking your joyful career path. We're going to talk about embracing fearlessness all season. And at the end of each session, you'll get a practical tips so that you can apply those lessons and an invitation to connect with us to explore your personalized path to joy. For those attending live, you will receive a free mini guide to use during today's webinar. And so while we do have some returning attendees, I know we've got some new people in the audience today who don't know us. So Johanna, would you introduce yourself?
Thank you so much, Marie. And yes, I'm Johanna Danaher, and I help people in career transitions, in those big pivots, get out of their own heads, get out of survival zone, and really move into a new chapter that feels energizing, grounded, and real. So, as an energy coach, as a career coach, I really focus on helping my clients strengthen confidence, find clarity, and make decisions that protect their well being while moving them forward. And through my Waves transformation journey, we bring values and strengths and energy back into the picture. So, what's next actually works for you. And what about you, Marie?
Yeah, so I'm the possibility partner and career coach for women whose current job is draining their soul and they want work that really fills their heart as well as their wallet. But they aren't really sure what that work is or how to make it happen once they figure that out. And so we use my Move to Joy framework as a guide to kind of discover their purpose and passion and what really energizes them at work. And then we apply my proprietary map process to find really creative solutions and unique strategies with really practical, boots on the ground kind of tactics so that they can have joy in their work and wealth in their life. So let's get started with today's webinar. So, Johanna, today we're talking about mistakes. So where do you see this idea of mistakes and making mistakes show up for you?
So great question and great topic, Marie. It's one that I think is so important for us all to really reflect on. And for me, this concept of making a mistake shows up all the time throughout my career. And it's really interesting. So I'm going to tell a little bit of a story to kind of highlight the mistake, right? Because my biggest career mistake was that I brought the wrong slide deck to a really important
Mm.
meeting. Right. And what this is all about is, I spent 25 years in the corporate environment. I was in recruiting, then I moved into organizational development, culture, career growth, and now I run my own business. And somewhere in the middle of that 25-year journey, I actually developed a habit that cost me a lot more than I realized. I used perfection as a substitute for worthiness. So the moment I was stepping into a new role, a new level, a new room, the story started. You're not ready. You need to prove that you belong here. And the way that I would prove it was that I would over prepare, I would over function, and I would polish everything until it gleamed.
Yeah, so tell me more about like where this started for you.
Yeah, well, early into my transition into the organization development space, I had the opportunity to really lean in and work on a huge major initiative. It was our company's inaugural culture day. 90,000 people, dozens of countries, one synchronized global moment. And I was sitting across from the CHRO about to present the plan for this event. I had prepared. The deck was structured. It was strategic. It was beautifully thought out. I was certain I had done everything right, but he didn't need a strategy deck. He already owned the vision. He had built it with the CEO. He needed execution. He needed tight timelines, decision points, risks mapped, next steps locked in. What I brought to that table skimmed when he really needed to dig. It was promise without precision. So that meeting ended without alignment. There was no drama, no explosions, but there was this quiet, very unmistakable sense that I had not delivered what that moment required. And I felt myself shrink. Now, that meeting did teach me things that no success could have. It taught me how to read the room operationally, not just emotionally. It taught me that strategic storytelling has to be paired with concrete delivery, that someone who owns the vision may need something completely different from someone still forming it, right? But I didn't see any of that yet. And I told myself I'd made a mistake, a big one.
Yeah, and you can feel the emotional weight of that, right? Stepping into a new role, presenting to senior leadership, and feeling like you completely flubbed it. And so, what's the story that you started to tell yourself from that mistake?
Yeah, well, the story wasn't just I brought the wrong deck. It went much deeper than that. The story I said and the words I used in my own brain at 3 o'clock in the morning when I was revisiting that 5, 6, 7, 10 years later was I wasn't ready. I didn't belong. One misstep defined my worth. Now, I had been working very hard to earn my place in that room. It was a new role, as I said, a new function, my first real big initiative. And the moment that that meeting didn't land, my brain jumped straight to identity. Not, I misread the brief, but I am someone who misreads the brief. Not, this didn't go as planned, but this proves I'm not the right person for this. And the questions that I kept asking myself, that I kept rehearsing in my brain or beating myself up with was, why didn't I anticipate what he needed? Why didn't I push for clarity? Why didn't I, do the right thing? Those really weren't questions. They were accusations that I was building against myself. So what I hadn't seen and at the time, and it really took me a long time to see this, was that I was so conditioned to believe that a mistake is evidence of something being wrong with you. And that comes across especially early in your career, and especially as a woman stepping into a new level of leadership. When you're new to the room and you're still trying to prove that you deserve to be there.
Yeah, yeah. And that idea, right, that you're replaying it not just 3 and 7 days later, but 7 and 10 years later. It's something that we often do when we feel like we've made that mistake and we internalize it and feel like we're like accusing ourselves of not being enough. So, with time and wisdom, what have you learned from this mistake?
Yeah, and this is where it gets really interesting. And it wasn't until I did get distance from it that I realized the mistake wasn't what actually happened in the meeting. It wasn't the deck. The mistake was the story I told myself afterwards. I made one missed moment mean something much bigger about who I was. Instead of thinking I misread what was needed, I went straight to I'm not ready. I don't belong. I need to be perfect in order to prove myself. So every single time I would step into something new, that story was the same. There was this inner sort of critic or judge running the narrative saying, you're not quite qualified. Not yet. Do more, prepare more, get another certification, make it perfect. Then you'll deserve to be here. And I did exactly that. I over prepared, I over functioned. I burned myself out making everything flawless before I could let anybody see it. I thought I was being responsible, committed, high performing. But what I couldn't see then was that I was also operating from fear. Right. And it cost me. It cost me a lot. It cost me energy. It cost me ease. And at times, it did cost me strategy because when you're so focused on getting everything exactly right, you actually lose sight of what matters in the moment. You aren't able to pivot quickly when new information comes forward because you're so focused on perfectionism. And so, what have I learned in this whole process is that mistakes are rarely the end of the story. Oftentimes, they're really the place where the real story begins. I've also learned that that harsh voice in your head after a misstep is not telling the truth. I've learned that growth asks for reflection, not for self punishment, not beating myself up, right? That voice might be signaling, ooh, there's something here to learn. There's something here for me to reflect on. There's something here for me to grow through. But I still feel that old instinct rise up to polish it more, to prove it more, to make sure everything is perfect before I let it be seen. But right now, I do catch it a lot faster.
Yeah, I that phrase you said, right? Growth requires reflection, not perfection. And that is so powerful as we start to look at what is a mistake and what those mistakes are costing us in terms of our growth and our energy. Because as you were pursuing that perfection, right, that over preparing and over functioning really drains your energy. And so what seemed like a single mistake has turned into for a long time, right? A career that where you never felt like you were enough because you always felt like you were the mistake as opposed to a mistaken slide deck.
Exactly. And honestly, it took me a long time to believe that, but I do believe it more now than ever that sometimes the thing you call a mistake was the very experience that taught you how to lead, how to see something differently, and how to, come back to yourself with much more wisdom than you had before. And maybe, just maybe, you actually can't make a mistake.
That's a powerful thought. Can't make a mistake. Hmm.
So, Marie, with that in mind, where do you see this myth showing up for you or for your clients?
Yeah, that's interesting, right? Because as we were preparing for this episode, I really was like, well, where do I see this showing up with my clients? And as I was trying to come up with a story to demonstrate, right, our teaching point, I was like, I really can't share a story about a client because as professional coaches, one of the things we adhere to with our professional ethics is that we will not judge our clients or their actions. And so when we look at that, I was like, ooh, I can't judge it as a mistake. So let me share my own mistake because I can judge myself like a boss. So my biggest career mistake was that I followed the rules,
Mm.
which for most of us, right? We learned we should follow the rules, right? It's one of those things you learn in kindergarten. And so for me, I've worked in organizations for 30 years, first as a teacher and then in corporate before I started my own business. And my mistake, and I repeated it over and over, was that I always stayed too long in a job that didn't fit, thinking I could make it work if I just behaved a little differently, or if I stay at same work, but maybe a different company. And I did that over and over and over.
And I think that that's a familiar experience that so many of us have. We stay in places because we think we should, right? And so I'm interested, Marie, if you could just tell us a little bit more about what the impact of that was on your journey.
Yeah. And when I look back with that perspective, I truly do see where I made this mistake, right? Judging my own actions over and over and over again. But the best example is an organization that I stayed with for 5 full years, even though I knew within 6 months it wasn't a good fit. So the first sign was that my direct manager left about 3 months after I started. This was perfectly normal to turnover. It wasn't anything major. But in this case, I applied for the position because I was actually highly qualified for it. And another woman who had worked there over 5 years, who was also highly qualified, applied for the position as well. Instead of hiring either of us, they brought in an unqualified male candidate. And that should have been my first heads up that maybe this organization didn't really believe in promoting from within, like they said, but instead believed in promoting the male. But even though I kind of got that sense, I made all sorts of excuses and stayed in the job. Fast forward 3 years later, there was a role I really wanted in the organization. I told my manager and my director for the last 12 months that if that job ever came open, I really wanted an opportunity to apply for it. And when it did come open unexpectedly, the organization didn't even advertise the position. They just brought in someone from the outside. So I not only didn't have a job, a chance at it, it was never even discussed with me. And not only that, they never even brought it up anywhere in conversation. And at that point, again, I should have said HR is not following their own rules. And I'm a rule follower, which we talked about. But I made the mistake and still stayed with that same company. And it was only after something similar happened a third time within that organization that I finally found a different job. And I repeated that pattern of staying over and over and rationalizing to myself why I should stay, despite having that knot of dread in my stomach driving in. Um, I would put in extra hours, even if there were unrealistic expectations of the staff. I would like, oh, if I just do this little bit for a few months, we'll get past this. And I kept justifying what I was doing. And it resulted in just exhaustion, impacts to my health, impacts to my personal life, unable to sleep from the stress of second guessing myself and watching every word I say because you're in a low trust environment. And still I stayed, even though I knew I should have left.
Yeah, and that's such a powerful example, Marie, right? Because you talked about how, you were judging sort of your own decisions, but you were rationalizing the decisions that the employer was making, right? So you were judging yourself harshly and telling yourself that you had to stay someplace for whatever reason. And I'm curious as to what that story was that you were telling yourself in those moments.
Yes. And mistakes are in so many ways, right? About the stories we tell ourselves. And for me, I was told you stay in a job because job hopping doesn't look good on a resume. I had realized that, maybe you couldn't stay at the same company for 30 years, right? That's a whole different rule and myth that we grew up with. But I was still told you need to stay at a job 5 to 8 years. It doesn't look good if you're constantly changing jobs. Um, I was also following the rule of it would be stupid to leave a secure job in the current economy. And it didn't matter what the economy actually was doing, you didn't leave a secure job. And so I'd also stay because I was afraid what if I tried something new and it didn't work out? Then I'd really regret it. So, like, we got that story, right? But it all comes back to, for me, is I had to follow the rules. I'd always been a rule follower, always been a goody two shoes because growing up, that was the way you earned love and affection in my family was by following the rules. So I followed that whole get good grades, get a good job rule, even when that quote unquote good job made me absolutely miserable.
And so what I'm hearing, Marie, is that there's this perception that, like in my story, that you have to do something in the right way. You have to follow the rules. And I'm curious, whose rules were you following? And what have you actually learned from this experience?
Yes, and it's interesting that you say that, right? Because we only make a mistake when we look back and judge it. And at the time when I was staying in those jobs, it didn't feel like a mistake. It felt like the right thing to do. It felt like what was best at that time. And it wasn't until I started working with a professional coach that I even realized that I kept making the same mistake over and over and kept repeating that pattern because of unwritten rules that I'd absorbed. And so for me, my unwritten rule was that you couldn't have money and be happy in your work. You had to choose. You could either have a job that paid well, or you could have a job that made you happy, but you'd never have money. And so that push and pull is what kept me staying in jobs that weren't right, even when my gut told me to move on, because I'd absorbed a belief that I wasn't supposed to be happy at work. And so now that I've developed an awareness of these unwritten rules, I realized that staying in those jobs wasn't actually a mistake. It was just what I'd been taught. And so now when I feel something isn't right in my career or right in my business, I don't rationalize it away. Instead, I listen to my intuition and I might need to make some changes and some choices in order to correct what feels off. Sometimes something radical like leaving a job, but sometimes it's small things like setting boundaries. But now it's a conscious choice instead of a judgment on myself for settling.
Yeah, and I think that's so important, right? When we recognize the story or the rules that we're telling ourselves, right? Or those beliefs that we've internalized. For you is that you had to stay and that you couldn't have both joy and success defined by you. And for me was that I had to prove myself to that I belonged, that I was worth it, right? Whatever it was. Those stories can take up so much space and so much energy, right? So I think our audience would be interested in hearing some tips on how they can really challenge that story that's in their mind or that inner critic language that shows up at 3 a.m. when they're rethinking and rehashing what happened that day. So, what are some of your tips on how to move forward when you think you've made a mistake?
Yes. And of course, our hope for our audience and those listening to this is that they won't spend years replaying those mistakes like you and I did, right? Um, and so when you do think you've made that mistake, so one of the big first steps, in fact, the critical first step, is really just to identify the situation that you are judging as a mistake, name what happened using data. Don't add interpretation. Just look at the facts. What occurred, when, and in what context? Because naming that moment and looking at it objectively instead of internalizing it emotionally is really that first step in reclaiming that as a growth reflection instead of a um, judgment mistake. So, what's the second step for them?
Yeah, the second step really digs into the story, right? So once we have named what actually has happened, we've identified the context, right? Then it's to understand what is the story that we're telling ourselves, right? We're looking at something objectively, looking at the facts, but there's a story that comes alongside oftentimes, right? So what is that? separate the who from the what language, right? Oftentimes we start to think about, I am a failure. I failed. I'm not good. I must be stupid for staying in a space that's not bringing me joy. Whatever the story is, we want to separate that I language from it. And let's just be factual, like you said. So, yeah, there was a failure. Yeah, something didn't go as planned. Okay. Yeah. Removing the I from that, taking yourself out of it, removes the emotion as well. And what's the third step?
Yeah. So we want to take that information, right? We've looked at the situation as data and information. We've removed the I from it and really remove those judgments and then take those mistakes and really reframe them for learning. And so in your story, it's I did bring the wrong slide deck. I did misread the room, but I'm not a failure. I just need to next time do something different so that doesn't happen again. In my case, it was, after the first time this happened, right? Instead of judging myself and telling myself stories, once you look at that data, go, this is not aligning in some way. And in my case, the company policies for HR was not aligning with actions. And so use that as decision making data rather than judgment on who we are.
Mhm.
So,
Yeah, it's so powerful, right? When we can focus on facts versus story versus interpretation versus assumptions, then we can actually look for those moments of growth and those moments of learning. And as you were talking, Marie, I was thinking about a quote. I think it was from, Einstein, might be wrong, but it was like the idea that you can't ever make a mistake because mistakes are just data points that help us learn what doesn't work so we can progress towards what does work, right?
yeah,
I didn't make a mistake 1,000 times. I just learned 1,000 ways that it doesn't work, right? So that's the way, and we think about the learning really enables us to move forward ourselves. So,
yeah,
Marie, this was a phenomenal conversation, and I know some of our listeners might be interested in how they can connect with us. So, both you and I work with clients who are navigating major career transitions. I work with anyone from starting off their career as an early talent, graduating from college, all the way through pre-retirees who are planning for the next phase. And you can connect with me at my website, anchor2aspire.com. That's anchor, T-O, aspire.com. And Marie works with people who desire a significant career pivot that brings them more joy and less stress. And you can connect with Marie at move2joycoaching.com. That's move, T-O, joycoaching.com.
yeah. And so they can not only go out to our websites to learn more about us, we each have separate newsletters that work with or are targeted towards, right, additional information for those that might want to learn more from us. And then we also have our next episode in our season 3 coming up. So our theme is Embrace Fearlessness. And in our episode 4, we'll be talking about control and the idea that you don't have to hold it all because controlling things feels safe until it doesn't. So you can follow along on our YouTube episode. It'll be posting in May of 2026. So
So,
thank you for joining us. Oh, good.
no, I was going to say thank you, Marie. This was such a great conversation.
Yes. All right. Bye, everyone.